Welcome everyone to the second to last session, I believe, today. This is the session on movement building and community organizing and how it relates to the HONK community. My name is Matt. Use he, him pronouns. I'm one of the Somerville HONK organizing committee members. Along with Whitney and Rebe, just so that I'm getting all the applause. I'm comfortable with that. And Kashif back there. Hi, Kashif. I also play in Good Trouble Brass Band. Awesome. And I also, outside of my work with HONK, I've done some political community organizing in the greater Boston area. Done a lot of Palestinian rights organizing, done a lot of mutual aid organizing. And this session was kind of born out of a very selfish desire to sort of reflect on kind of where we're at with, movement building on the left and, what we've seen in the last decade and, where HONK plays a role in that. We had the conversations earlier on band dynamics, shout out to Sarah. And then we had conversations on tactics, how do bands show up in tactics, shout out to Ted and Sarah again. And so now the goal is to kind of, in my mind, zoom out another level, which is to think not just about how do we show up at actions, but what is the role of HONK music, what is the role of the HONK community in strategy and long-term building. And just a heads up, this session's gonna be a little bit different. You will be required to talk to your neighbors. So if that is uncomfortable, you are allowed to leave, no judgment. But we're going to spend a lot of time for this in small group conversation, and then I'm going to ask you all to share out some of the reflective conversations you've been having in your small groups. So I just wanted to give that a heads up. And I also wanted to establish some community conversation norms. So kind of, these are not like rules to follow in conversation. They're more like, here's what we're aspiring to do in conversation so that we can be reminded if we're not showing up in the way we want to. An example is one conversation norm that I like to use is move up, move back, which is the idea of like being mindful of how much space I'm taking up in the conversation. Am I talking a lot more than the people I'm with? Then maybe I pause for a second, let the silence linger, let someone else step into that space. And also maybe I'm not sharing a lot, but maybe I do have things to say. So maybe I move in and actually share some stuff. So that's one conversation norm I would love for us to aspire to. Another one is honoring intent and impact in what we say. And so the idea there is that we do want to assume that in this space we're arriving with the best intentions. And so sort of believing that no one's coming in and saying things maliciously. And also, it's really still possible for harm to be perpetrated unintentionally, and to acknowledge that just because we had the best intentions, that doesn't mean that the impact isn't also important. So elevating both to the same level. And also, I'd love to embody the idea of a brave space, leaning into discomfort, not into harmful conversation, but sometimes it can be hard to talk about these things, and it's okay to have uncomfortable conversations. So those are some conversation norms I'd love for us to think about. Also, we're probably going to use the one diva, one mic one, which is when you talk, we're going to have one person talking at a time. That goes for like small group conversations, but also in share outs, mainly because we actually do need the mic for recording. So when I do say one diva, one mic, I mean one mic. Just everyone knows that. Cool, so that's that. Anyone have any questions about conversation norms, stuff like that? Okay. What I would love for you all to do right now is to break up into groups of 3 or 4 with your neighbors around you. I want you to introduce yourselves with the following prompt for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I want you to say your name, your pronouns if you feel comfortable sharing them, and then your prompt for what to share with each other. Sorry, I need everyone's attention for just one more second. When you think about movement organizing or political organizing on the left in this moment, what are some feelings that evokes? What are some questions that brings up for you? What are you noticing about that in your own view of the world? And I'm going to ask, after you all introduce yourselves, to have a couple of people share some of the conversation that happens in your group. So just be prepared to have someone share out with the larger group after you talk a bit about general introduction conversation. Any questions about that? I will also be around to, if you have any specific question. Yeah, Lisa. about 5 to 8 minutes. Yeah. The prompt is, when you think about political organizing and movement building on the left in today's day and age, what kind of feelings does that evoke, and what sort of questions and opinions does that bring up for you? All right, please finish up your last thought. And then we're going to hear from you all as a group. There is nothing I love more than when I have to pull people to a larger conversation. They're very much enjoying their smaller conversations. And there's nothing I hate more than making you end your conversations early. However, we do have a little bit of an agenda to keep. So I would love to hear what some of the themes were that were coming up in your conversations. So I'm curious if anyone is willing to share some general broad trends that we're noticing in your small groups.
One thing that resonated for all of us in this group that we were just talking about is the tension between trying to build a mass movement that's widely appealing and strongly maintaining our values and not compromising on things that are maybe less popular. And
it's such a hard tension. Oh my gosh, thank you for naming that. But yeah, totally. Also, by the way, if you hear anything that you really resonate with and you would like to express that, some ways that I would offer to do that, you could do spirit fingers. You could also do in ASL, there's also like resonation. And so just if you hear something that you like that someone else said, feel free to express that as well. Is there anything else that people would like to share about the conversations they were having? Tension, yes?
So we were talking about how in the left right now, maybe with one of our members, right, that we're seeing the absence of certain groups, and that's of concern. There's an absence of young people, there's an absence of people of color, there's an absence of unions, like in certain kinds of organizing spaces. So that was noted as a concern. Another one of us talked about how in the direct action work they participate in, there's a lot of overcapacity, and people are very precarious right now and really vulnerable, and if health insurance goes away, there's going to be a lot of people who physically can't participate, right, in organizing because they have health concerns they have to take care of and negotiate. And then I think the point that I brought up was that I see Palestine as being this huge point of contention that split many left groups that weren't, that I think people thought they agreed, right, on lots of things, and then when Palestine, when it became necessary to really, stand against genocide, be on the side of Palestine, a lot of groups couldn't do that. And so there's there's a lot of groups, I think, right now that are not being able to be as effective as they could be because they are kind of overwhelmed with this, existential crisis about where to stand when it comes to Palestine. For me, it feels clear. For other people, it's not clear. Therefore, we're kind of like negotiating that right now in the left at large.
So issues bringing up conflict and tension where there wasn't before, vulnerability in community members, and perhaps not having like a larger diverse group of people at the table, or people at different tables. Yeah, definitely resonate with that, absolutely. Anyone else have anything they would like to share? Yeah.
We were talking about, just to what you were saying, we were talking about how, is this better? How within some groups there are generational differences on how to or whether to prioritize advocating for Palestine. And that sort of, I think, feels alienating maybe to the younger crews that are like have the energy to participate and advocate, but don't feel maybe the support of their elders in the group. We were talking also, am I generally representing it right? We were talking also about just like this ostriching movement that we see in people just after the latest election. People just like put their hand in the head in the sand and feel paralyzed. And what am I missing? Oh yeah, and we notice the reactiveness in the movement. Maybe not lack of like future thinking and long-term thinking and planning, and more like a reactive stance.
I highly resonate with that last point. I mean, with everything you said, but also that last point, especially the reactiveness. The idea that a lot of what organizing looks like right now is urgent and immediate and not always yet planning for the long term. Whereas that's kind of what, I was hoping we could talk about in this session, which is that like, how can we be thinking in that longer term? Because it is really hard. And I don't always think that, I was hearing from the last session a lot of discussion about how sometimes in action planning, the music is not always like centered or brought in early enough in the conversation. And there's a whole question in my mind about whether also music should be more centered in the strategy as well, the longer term. What does it look like to build towards something? And yeah, that is a real issue, I would say right now. That urgency, that reactiveness, that lack of sort of like longer term proactive in a direction. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Yeah.
I just want to add that it's related to all of that. And the reactive is not only to what's happening around us, although the shit has been going on for a long time. So if you're reacting to something at the moment, you need to be going deeper. But also, our emotional reactions to stuff is not a good way to like organize. There are some folks that are, and some folks that are, I'm going to yell at you right in your face because that, and just so it's really a task for us to struggle maybe with ourselves and our own stuff, which comes from capitalism anyway.
Struggling with our own stuff that comes from capitalism. Yes, 100%. I'm just repeating that because I resonate with it very much. Oh, sorry. Yes.
They often say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the next best time is today. If you haven't been organizing or working with a community, you can't just go up and say, hey, I'm your ally and you should trust me. It doesn't work like that. You got to do the work. But what we were talking about in our group was there's some hope, actually, which is I was really active in the WTO ministerial in Seattle. And a lot of what MAGA people say is a lot of the same things the protests were saying back then about elite control of the economy. There is some intersection there. We're not all going to be happy about everything, but there's room to work there. So that's my little ray of sunshine.
I like that ray of sunshine. And I'm going to use very disparate threads from this and make it sound like they all relate to our next topic of conversation. You mentioned that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. HONK is 20 years old this year. And we talked about not always feeling like they're intergenerational spaces. I would say HONK for me has been one of the most intergenerational spaces I've ever been in. And HONK is, of course, not perfect, and there's a lot of lack of representation in the HONK community and HONK leadership that we struggle with and have been talking about and struggling with for years. However, one thing I will say about HONK when we think about community building and movement building is that it is robust. The community has been around since before the first HONK festival 20 years ago. The community has persisted when certain social movements that I've been part of have come and gone in that same time period. It has members of the community who do not disagree, who do not agree on a lot of, say, political issues, but still show up with each other, and maybe have very heated conversations about it, but then come to the festival again the next year or show up at a different festival together. And also, I would say HONK has a lot of anti-capitalist infrastructure. So what I mean when I say anti-capitalist infrastructure is that when I think about things like conferences or music festivals, things that are sort of analogs for what we do, a lot of times you pay a big fee, you show up, you have to find housing for yourself, you have to find food for yourself. Regardless of which HONK you're at, whether it calls itself activist or not, most of the time you're being provided a place to stay. And it's not at a hotel, it's in the community. You're showing up and you're getting fed. These are things of community providing for other across time, across distance, that are in ways that are, I would say, pretty anti-capitalist. And so I think that there is something about the HONK community, about HONK festivals, that is inherently anti-capitalist and somewhat robust. And so one thing that has been coming up for me as we think about that ray of sunshine looking forward, and we think about how to build community in a way that's sustainable across time. I am curious, I've been thinking about what lessons to learn from HONK, what things we do well that allow those kinds of things to persist across time. Intergenerational relationships, anti-capitalist structures for events, things like that. And so I would love for the next round of small group conversations for there to be a little bit of a discussion around what are those things that work so well as we think about what can we do in movement building to really start to engage other people to build sustainability and not just kind of get to burnout so quickly. So I'm going to ask you to go back into your small groups. I'm going to ask you to think about what are the elements, whether you're in HONK or whether you've been in other spaces that you've seen have been very sustainable, what are the elements of a community that you've been part of that make it robust, that make it last over time, that make it build and not sort of like flash away when there's a lot of like energy that people get burned out from. And then we're going to talk about what themes across groups after a little bit of conversation. This one's going to be more like 8 to 10 minutes. So you have a little bit longer for this conversation. All right, y'all, same deal. What'd you talk about? Tell me and tell each other. Who's interested in sharing? Yes. There and then here.
So we talked around a little bit, and then we came to a couple of important words that we felt were contributing to how HONK is sustainable and probably would make other organizations sustainable, which is that we get a lot of joy out of being together, and then the self-nourishment we get from a HONK festival that isn't just for feeding the audience great music, but is also wonderful for feeding ourselves by being together, by playing for each other at our parties and at night. And that is what makes people want to come back and do it again.
Joy and mutual nourishment, is that kind of fair to say? Yeah, 100% agree, absolutely. Now coming back up to the front.
It's funny that you say nourishment, because we didn't talk about HONK, but we talked about other organizations we've been involved with like this. And a lot of the robustness and cohesiveness was around food and around getting together when there's not a requirement of something else going on, and just relating to each other, learning about people, food, a lot about the RMO band health thing I was thinking of even. So yeah, that's kind of where we ended up a whole lot was about that. So.
Absolutely. Literal feeding in addition to spiritual feeding. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Just to echo on that kind of nourishing nature, I think one of the things that we talked about was how HONK, and it just gives you more energy than you put into it. So that's kind of a way that it's sustaining, and there's so many things that you can do politically that can be draining at times and cause burnout, and so this is just something that helps to sustain. We also were musing about, is there a similar thing on the right, and the closest we could get to is maybe like church community, because it really is a form of community that we have, and that's really important, I think, to why people come back. so I think there is community on the right, but it's a little bit more top down and controlled in a way. And so it's a little bit of a weakness that it's diversified and balkanized, and we have different views, but it's also a strength.
Absolutely, and it's a strength when we kind of engage in it in a constructive way. Were you raising your hand too?
So I think we talked about how, well, I happened to be sitting with some HONK committee members, and so I was hearing some of the skinny, right? And what I was gathering was that the organizing, the core of people who work for this, to kind of make this happen, there's a real positive and supportive environment in which it's not about who, what you do wrong, it's like how can we work together to make it right, So if there's a problem, no one dwells on the problem, it's on the solution as a collective. And so that's really helpful, I think, the people who put in so much energy and time and passion into this, like it's a positive space. So I think that is really helpful and self-sustaining. And then I think the fact that it centers activism and politics is what I think makes HONK successful, because that's a very special space. We don't have spaces like that maybe anywhere, where you have music and politics living side by side, both being nourished, supported, and they are mutually supported and mutually supportive, I suppose. And to see that and have that space, that's why I come back every year. So that, to me, is a big sign of success for HONK here in Somerville. And then I think you were talking about how, like, where we are, it's the community that this festival exists in. It works really well. Like, we kind of, there is a commitment to being part of the community and also like taking over the community in a sense with the festival. And so it's very clear as to what is happening, and this is a big thing that everyone can participate in and everyone sees, and it is a real happening, right, that happens for this community, and it's very energizing for this community. So that also is a great sign of success.
Thank you. And also, just to throw my HONK committee members under the bus, we dwell. We definitely dwell too. Yeah. We definitely have times where we dwell, I would say. Fair to say, you too, I would say? Yeah. And we eventually get to that same team and moments of that as well. But yeah, no, I think that I resonate a lot with what you said, especially when it comes to the aspect of the focus, this notion of like having a very explicit value system. I think some of the other things I was hearing, just to try and synthesize a bit, I was also hearing a lot mentioned around, there's a lot of this like energizing both for yourself and for others, nourishment. And I think like one of the things that I think, especially when you're talking about how maybe on the right, but also on the left, religious institutions play this role. There's a lot around how music, food, and ritual end up playing a role. How those music and food are brought into regular, expected time together. And I think that is something that having ritual, having that regular touch point is also something that's important. There is a sense in which, like, HONK festivals, especially ones that have now existed for over 10 years, have become a ritual. That is a thing. There's a certain expectation about how they look and how we are together. And that also allows it to become a happening when you know what's happening and you know what you're getting out of it and you can give to it. And a lot of what these things are, and then I'll come to you, Ruby, after that, I would also label under a term that I learned a long time ago that I think a lot about when I think about brass bands and the HONK festival, which is movement infrastructure. And what I mean by movement infrastructure is that movements also often have a goal for a change they want to see, but they of course need operations and logistics and infrastructure to make that goal happen, to make sure burnout doesn't happen, to make sure that people are continuing to move purposefully together in a large tent. And that requires things like food. But it also requires things like a brass band to be the battery of your action, because the music fuels the chanting, which fuels the music, which fuels the chanting, in like a perpetual motion machine kind of thing. And I think that that is one general theme that honk music, and the honk community especially, something that we do pretty well, is movement infrastructure, the feeding of each other, the housing of each other, the playing of music as a form of energy that gives back to ourselves as well as to others. And then Ruby, do you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, some of the points here were joy was the first thing that was mentioned. But a couple things in addition in terms of support. Also a win, because a song is a win. You win, you finished it. I mean, look at when you finish playing a gig, everybody with other people, there's a high, and you've won. You know, small wins that somebody brought up add up. And the other thing is related to support, that you all have created and built a support, a whole community around the honk community. Well, I'm saying you all, the honk organizers, the honk whatever, the honk organizers have created a whole community of support where it allows the anti-capitalist thing of like, you know, we're not going to have people pay for hotels, and people are like, yeah, come here. You know, that people can't wait for next year to open their houses and drive people here and there. They're looking forward to it. And so it's already made a community within a community. And I think that's something that's fundamental.
Absolutely. I 100% agree and resonate. And I'm going to look at my phone to see time. And okay, 5 minutes. That's really not a lot of time. All right. So this last part is going to be, I'm going to, instead of having you go into your small groups, this is going to be a group conversation, but I'm going to ask you to take a second to think just, you know, individually about this last question, and then we'll see if you have any thoughts. But I think it's really just kind of the logical next step of, cool, we seem to do movement infrastructure well. And I think it just becomes a question about how do we bring that to support the movements that are out there that are pushing for change, and where there might be existing burnout, or where there might be a need for some of that movement infrastructure. How can we bring some of the lessons learned here in terms of what helps with sustainability, joy, music, food, all together, to support the work of labor unions, to support the work of movements that might be under more direct attack, to also think about, you know, or build space for thinking about how we not only react, but how we proactively build the future for tomorrow. And that's a very redundant statement. And I think it's also like, how do we in our own community continue to build some of those structures of tomorrow as well? So it's a very big question, which is like, well, what do we do with these themes that we think do work pretty well? And how do we use them to support this current moment on the left, where we're under a lot more attack than we have been? I mean, it's been like this for a while, but there's an acute moment happening right now, I would say. So take a second and think about how we take these tools and use them to support others. And then we're going to talk about it in a big group. But take 2 seconds of silence, or 60 seconds of silence. wants to break the silence? Yeah?
I just want to actually give a shout out to this whole day. It's amazing that it's happened, and I think the beauty of it is, so this is a free festival. There's support for a Tufts. I don't know how they got the space, and there's food, all these things. So people have been presenting, and the resources that they have, they may not have thought of sharing, but people said, can you make that available? How can we get this stuff? And that's really organic. And then a lot of people who are in these bands are also part of groups or in touch with groups, and you can start sharing the resources. It can be an organic, and it can also be an intentional process as well. So I just kudos for stuff like this because it's rare. And that's one way that this, HONK used to be just Davis Square, back in the day. Now it's like everywhere. So this conference is a really great example of one way to get the word out and share our resources and make them available.
Absolutely, and thank you for pointing out how awesome this day has been and all the work that went into making it happen. Truly, let's give a round of applause to that as well. All right, any last thoughts before we close down? Yeah.
I spend a lot of time thinking about the effects of music on a body and how we're feeling in our bodies in the movement. And so thinking about how everybody's in shock and sort of like crunch muscles mode, and how long controlled exhales actually stimulate your vagus nerve which down regulates your nervous system. And we all know this, we're experiencing that together. But other people might not, that don't have experience with music. And so sharing that knowledge by example, looping people into singing, into playing, into swaying, into tapping, will help them think better and take a step, not react maybe, or like cope with the struggles of the shocking news better, which I think,
100%. The role of music as a sort of just way of being to make it easier to have. You said it better than I can. I'm not going to try and repeat what you said. But thank you all for coming to this session and inviting me and just talking to each other. Really appreciate that. I think one thing I just want to leave with you all, like a personal reflection when it comes to movement building, and especially that long-term vision when it feels like we have to be reacting to so many things with so much urgency this moment, is that some of that long-term building can still happen in kind of the way that we just be in non-activist spaces. So thinking about how am I bringing the ritual of music into other spaces? How am I thinking about going on a trip to see people and or going on a trip somewhere and whether I'm looking to stay, go somewhere where I can stay with someone I know versus whether I'm going somewhere and staying in like an Airbnb. Not there's anything wrong with staying in Airbnb. I'm not trying to say that. But I think thinking about how you can also be grounded in values and how you engage with community outside of just activist spaces. I think that a lot of these things allow us to, in small ways, build towards those kind of that infrastructure and those alternative anti-capitalist structures that we want in just smaller moments in our everyday life. So I think taking those lessons learned into not just who you organize with and how those spaces look, but how you engage in housing and conversations with friends and what you do in your community, I think is actually something that can be very constructive as well. All right, well, I'm going to pass it over to, I think, Reby for this last session. So stay here for some stories told.